Hey everybody! Today I want to talk to you about the Gilded Age. What it is, how it got its name, why it's so significant in U.S. history. First of all, the Gilded Age lasted from roughly 1868 to 1901. Now, the term gilded, that's not really a word we use a lot today, but it actually means covered thinly with gold leaf or gold paint. And what you need to understand is that gilded, if something is gilded, it's not a compliment to say that something is gilded. Think of, getting a necklace and it looks like gold, but then you look a little bit deeper and you say, wait a minute, that's not gold. That's some kind of cheap metal with a gold layer over it. That's what we would call gilded. So when the term Gilded Age was applied to this time period, it was not a compliment. A lot of people think, oh, Gilded Age, Golden Age, it must have been amazing and beautiful and wonderful. But actually, the term gilded, again, is not what you want to be called. It just basically, when they were saying the Gilded Age, they were saying it's something bad that's just covered thinly in gold to make it look good. So, the Gilded Age, again, is the time period after the Civil War until the turn of the 20th century, around 1901, when Theodore Roosevelt came into office. Now, just a note, notice I said came into office. He was not elected president his first time in office because he was the vice president for President McKinley, who was assassinated. We'll get into that later. But again, the Gilded Age is the Civil War to around 1900, 1901, when Roosevelt became president. Now, the first two people to ever call it the Gilded Age was Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner. They wrote a book together called The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. And again, this term gilded was not a compliment. It was used to kind of ridicule or criticize. We call it satire. And what they did was the two men created two stories that were funny and just almost on the verge of ridiculous about two different families who were trying to make money during this time period. And one really neat thing about this book is that Mark Twain's story is about a family, a fictional family from Tennessee. And this was just a good, hard-working family whose patriarch, the father, the leader of this family named Si, he decides he wants to become rich. And so he goes through this huge story, this huge thing, trying to sell off his land in Tennessee to make a lot of money. And it ends up, all that trouble and hardship ends up getting passed to his daughter, who goes through the same thing. And it's kind of almost like a fall from grace story of this family that was doing well, but they just weren't satisfied with that, and they wanted more, and they wanted more, and they ended up, in the end, having a lot less. And Mark Twain later wrote in his autobiography that this story was loosely based on his own father, who bought a large parcel of land in Tennessee in hopes to sell it at a big profit, and after 40 years of waiting and waiting, they ended up selling it at a loss. Now, the main thing that brought this book around, that gave them the idea for this book, is that they noticed all of the greed in the marketplace and all of the corruption within government, from the highest forms of government to the local, state, and city governments. And they said that it was gilded because all of society's big problems, all of their major problems, such as poverty and hunger and lack of education, had seemed to be covered by a thin coating of gold, and that people seemed to just kind of overlook it because of this thin coating of gold. And that's how they came up with the term gilded. And they said a thin coating of gold, things were covered in a thin coating of gold, because there was a lot of money out there, a lot of money being made, and there were some extremely, extremely wealthy people in the United States during this time. However, most of the people in the United States were barely making enough money to feed themselves or their family. So let's talk about some positive aspects of the Gilded Age, because there were a lot of good things that came out of the Gilded Age. First of all, the economy of the United States grew rapidly and it generated immense wealth. Railroads and telephone lines were spread from one coast to the other during this time. And today we think of railroads and we think of, most of us don't even have home phones anymore. But, you have to remember back then, this was huge. This was like the internet. This was the superhighway of that time. And because of these railroads, you now had faster communications between both sides of the country. And it was great opportunities for entrepreneurs to create these products. And no matter where they were in the country, they could make a product, and then through the railroads, they could send it to anywhere else they want. They could sell it to any other part of the country. This was also a time of new technologies, and a lot of products that were already in existence were improved upon. And so this improved the lives of many people. And the next area is all of the great entrepreneurs that came out of this time period. And at the end of this unit, at the end of this week, you guys are going to choose one of these entrepreneurs, or an entrepreneur that, on your own that you're interested in, and you are going to do a little presentation on them. Now, I just listed some of the really big names from the Gilded Age, but if you know of other names of entrepreneurs from the Gilded Age that you want to do your research on, you're more than welcome to. But you see Henry Ford and his cars, Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Charles Merrill, George Eastman. If you live in East Tennessee, that name should be very familiar, especially if you live in Kingsport. Levi Strauss. Still to this day, Levi jeans are, some of the most sought after jeans. And they were, Levi Strauss was the man who first made these jeans during the Gilded Age, during the late 1800s. So remember that this slide is here, because later on this week when you go to do that presentation, these are some names that can help you. And I just think it's so amazing at all the names that you see here that we still know of today. I mean, Kellogg, Hershey, that's the Kellogg, that's the Hershey bar. Harley and Davidson, yes, that's Harley Davidson. Sears, that's Sears. So I just think it's so amazing that these people created products, created stores, and they're still around to this day. So those are some positive aspects. Now let's look at some of the negative aspects. We talked about great wealth being created, yet it was only in the hands of the few. Most people worked from sunup until sundown in very poor conditions, barely making enough money to live day to day, while other people, very few, a very small handful, lived in immense riches, these palaces, and they just lived these lives that we could not even really comprehend. Also during this time, there became a really big divide between laborers and the wealthy elite. And you would have these violent strikes, and many people worried that it was going to tear the country apart again, and there was going to be another civil war just over this, such a huge difference in the poor and the wealthy. Also during this time, farmers saw great losses, And probably one of the biggest things is American politics was so plagued with corruption due to all of this wealth that was being created, and they wanted a piece of it. President Grant's administration was full of corruption. We watched a video last week that talked about that, and he actually apologized at the end of his term, and said flat out that he knew that people he had assigned to certain posts were very corrupt, and he apologized for that. Political figures and big business, these big companies, were they were greatly intertwined, meaning they were working side by side to keep the money in the big business and also within the pockets of the political figures. And so, laws to give better pay and better working conditions to the laborers were rarely talked about or considered in Congress because congressmen and women did not want to upset these big business leaders. So you can see that during this time period, during the Gilded Age, there were some really great things going on, but there were also some really bad things going on. And everyone knew that, you know, the bad things had to be fixed. Working conditions had to be fixed. Wages had to be fixed. Monopolies had to be broken up so that this wealth could be spread out more to everyone within the country. Now, the last thing I want to do is just show you some of the homes and talk to you a little bit about some of the super wealthy people who lived during this time period. Now, today we have extremely wealthy people in our country. We have billionaires in our country, but they don't own homes like what you saw during this time period. And this is Alva Belmont's chateau on Fifth Avenue in New York. Part of this building is still there today. Some parts of it have been demolished and replaced with a huge skyscraper. But this chateau here, is known as the mansion that started the Great House era. And Alva Belmont was an extremely wealthy woman. She was born into wealth and then she married into wealth. And she was, she had this amazing life. But she also did some great things for people throughout. And other than having a home that looks like this, she was very big into women's suffrage, into gaining the right of women to vote in the United States. And she was a big voice for that. And so that was definitely a positive in her life. I had to show you this home because this is the Eastman Mansion in Rochester, New York. And again, Eastman Chemical Company is in Kingsport, Tennessee. And so any of you who live here on the eastern side of Tennessee, you've heard of Eastman. But this is his home in his birthplace of Rochester, New York. I wanted to show you this home not just because it's ridiculously big, but also because was built by a woman. And this woman used her own money. She was an author. She was an award-winning, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of the early 1900s. And so it was a really big deal that this woman had made enough money on her own to build a home like this. This is a beautiful estate in Rhode Island, but the biggest reason why I wanted to show it to you is because the owner, John Jacob Astor IV, was actually one of the very elites who perished on the Titanic. And last, we have the Biltmore Estate. And living in East Tennessee like I do, I've been to the Biltmore Estate, which is in Asheville, North Carolina. This is still to this day the largest home in the United States, and it was built by the Vanderbilt family. It's an amazing, amazing place to go see. If you ever have a chance, you definitely should. And a lot of homes built during the Gilded Age are today museums or, a tourist destination like this one here. And it's amazing to go and just to try to put yourself into the life of how these people lived during that time. So that's the Gilded Age. If you have any more questions or if you want to know more about anything we've talked about, please just send me an email.